Ernest Dowson, Gone with the Wind. You're probably familiar with the novel Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell and the subsequent film, although you may be much less familiar with Ernest Dowson, the man who penned the phrase in his poem Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cynarae, where the line Gone with the Wind originates from. Dowson was a decadent poet writing at the same time as his friend Oscar Wilde. Although Ernest fell into relative obscurity after his death, his poems continued to have a profound influence on later writers. Dowson was born in 1867 to an upper-class English family. His father, Alfred, was an intelligent man who owned a dry dock in Limehouse, London. He had schooled Ernest as a child and took the family on many trips abroad, usually to France, where Dowson developed his love of the country, its literature, and the decadent literary movement. His mother, Annie, was a beautiful but very melancholic woman. Photographs of her exhibit someone beset with worries, so much so that when Ernest showed a friend a photograph of his mother, his friend couldn't help weeping at the sight of her sorrowful face. Dowson had one younger brother, Roland, who was many years his junior. During his time studying at Oxford, where he became something of a cult figure for his adherence to decadent ideals and his charm, his family hit serious financial difficulties, and he was forced to leave the university without explaining the reason to his friends. Tragedy struck the family when his father, suffering from tuberculosis, died from an overdose of his medication in 1894. It was speculated at the time by family and friends that his death might have been a deliberate act on his part, but it was recorded as natural, and a secretive silence was maintained on the subject. Ernest's mother, beside herself with grief and the family's financial troubles, hanged herself 6 months later. Losing both his parents in such circumstances had a noticeable effect on Dowson, and his friends at the time regarded it. He became much more dejected and disenchanted with everything. During the time of his father's illness, he had been extremely productive with his prose writing, but in the year after his parents' deaths, he leaves almost no record of himself. This personal tragedy was not the only cause of his dejection, for he had fallen in love with a 12-year-old Polish girl named Adelaide, and the daughter of a restaurant proprietor that he enjoyed visiting. Needless to say, this disturbing revelation didn't go down well with anyone, and although there is no evidence of any wrongdoing on his part, he was turned down by the girl when he proposed to her, causing him to fall into a deeper depression. He maintained his friendship with her and the family, however, and years later was invited to Adelaide's wedding, but was out of the country at the time and unable to attend. He sent his friend Moore to attend in his place and bring his wedding present to the couple. Adelaide would also die prematurely from septicemia following an abortion, just 3 years after Dowson's own death. Ultimately, Dowson would turn to drink. Absinthe was his favourite poison, and he is quoted as saying, "Whiskey and beer for fools, absinthe for poets." Absinthe was very popular during this time, especially for poets and artists, but after its supposed addictive and psychoactive properties were revealed, it was banned across Europe and the US by 1915. Dowson was already addicted, though, and using the drink to sustain him through illness, social engagements, and his low moods. He still continued to write and wrote some of his greatest poetry during this time. He received an allowance from a publisher for his translation work, a failed attempt to help him get back his life on track. He also travelled, notably spending time with Oscar Wilde in Paris after his trial. Eventually, however, his bad habits caught up with him, and in 1899, Robert Sherard, a novelist and biographer, found him destitute and in bad health in a wine bar. He took him back to his cottage and nursed him. Dowson was suffering from a severe cough which had plagued him often throughout his life and could have been the result of tuberculosis. He died on the 23rd of February 1900 at Sherard's home. Gerard states that he had called for the doctor and was bathing Dowson's forehead when the poet fell forwards onto his shoulder, dead. The doctor arrived an hour later. Dowson was 32 years old. When Oscar Wilde heard of the news of Dowson's death, he wrote to a friend, "Poor wounded, wonderful fellow that he was, a tragic reproduction of all tragic poetry, like a symbol or a scene. I hope bay leaves will be laid on his tomb, and rue and myrtle too, for he knew what love is." The poem, Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cynarae, meaning I am not as I was in the reign of good Cynara, remains one of his most famous poems. The poem has a tragic tone as the speaker acknowledges that his best days are behind him, and he is unable to enjoy himself in his old exploits, namely parties, drinking, and sleeping with prostitutes, because of an old love. It's more than just the lament of a lovesick man, however. To me it reads like the death cry of the decadents, when squeezing so much pleasure out of life so fast, and finding that now nothing pleases him any more. None of these things scratch the itch any longer. Then what is there left for him in life? The name Cynara is actually the Greek for artichoke, and the Greek mythological origin of this plant is that Zeus fell in love with a beautiful girl called Cynara and took her to live as a goddess on Olympus. She, however, missed her family and her old life, so snuck back to visit them. Zeus, then seeing this as the ultimate betrayal, turned her into the artichoke. It's unclear who Cynara was to Dowson, but there is a strong argument for it being based on Adelaide, who famously rejected him. Interestingly, Oscar Wilde once described Dowson as the greatest erotomaniac in Europe. Erotomania is a psychological disorder whereby a person strongly believes that another is in love with them, despite having no evidence to support it. They are often obsessive and unable to be persuaded otherwise by anyone, even the person they are in love with outright rejecting them. This is interesting because it suggests that Dowson may have viewed Adelaide like Cynara, that she is betraying him and her love for him for the sake of her family, perhaps. Either way, his repetition of the tragic line, "I have been faithful to thee in my fashion," is unconvincing even to himself. He knows he hasn't been faithful. But the line mirrors the greater realization about his life. He has been faithful to the fashion, and it has destroyed him, including his ability to be faithful to his love. And now it has all run aground and he has nothing left, except perhaps regret. The tragic feel of this poem was picked up on by later poet Viola Taylor Garvin, who quoted it in her poem The House of Caesar, about the decline of the Roman Empire. Both poems have become famous for being referenced in the final note of Conan the Barbarian author Robert E. Howard before he took his own life. It seems that self-destruction still haunts Dowson's memory. I will now finish with a reading of Non sum qualis eram bonae sub regno Cynarae. Last night, yesternight, betwixt her lips and mine, there fell thy shadow, Cynara. Thy breath was shed upon my soul between the kisses and the wine, and I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, I was desolate and bowed my head. I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion. All night upon mine heart I felt her warm heart beat. Night long within mine arms in love and sleep she lay. Surely the kisses of her bought red mouth were sweet, but I was desolate and sick of an old passion. When I awoke and found the dawn was grey, I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion. I have forgot much, Cynara, gone with the wind, flung roses, roses riotously with the throng, dancing to put thy pale, lost lilies out of mind. But I was desolate and sick of an old passion. Ye, all the time, because the dance was long, I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion. I cried for madder music and for stronger wine, but when the feast is finished and the lamps expire, then falls thy shadow, Cynara, the night is thine, and I am desolate and sick of an old passion. Yea, hungry for the lips of my desire, I have been faithful to thee, Cynara, in my fashion.